Hey there, do you know what time it is right now? I do. I wake up at the same time every single night, 3:33 a.m. Been happening for 28 years now. If you're watching this between midnight and 4 a.m., alone somewhere, maybe it's time to reconsider some of your choices. Drop a comment below, let me know where you're watching from, especially if you're from Oregon. I hope to God you're not near Highway 49. It took me 28 years to be ready to tell this story. If what I'm about to share makes sense to you, if you've ever felt that strange sensation on empty roads at night and thought you were alone in feeling it, please hit that subscribe button, because I have more stories to tell. And maybe, just maybe, they might save your life someday. Take a deep breath. Here we go. In my 27 years with the Oregon State Highway Patrol, I wrote 12,000 tickets, responded to 800 accidents, and saved 47 lives. But there's one number I can't forget. 3:33 a.m., October 15th, 1995. My name is Officer Michael Torres, and what I'm about to tell you isn't some campfire story or urban legend passed down through the ranks. This happened to me, and it's the reason I walked away from a career I loved, a pension I'd earned, and a life that made sense. Some people think I had a breakdown, that the stress of the job finally caught up with me. My therapist suggested it might have been a fugue state brought on by exhaustion. But I know what I experienced that night on Highway 49, and no amount of rationalization can explain it away. I need you to understand something before I continue. I was a good cop. Not the kind who was just putting in time until retirement, but someone who genuinely cared about keeping people safe. My record was spotless, my arrest statistics were consistently high, and I had more commendations than I could fit on my uniform. I'm telling you this not to brag, but because I need you to know that I wasn't some rookie who spooked easily or a burnout seeing things that weren't there. I was sharp, I was experienced, and I knew the difference between reality and imagination. At least, I thought I did. October of 1995 had been unseasonably cold in Oregon, the kind of cold that seeps through your uniform and settles into your bones during those long night shifts. I was working the graveyard shift on Highway 49, a stretch of road that runs through some of the most isolated parts of the state. It's the kind of highway that truckers use to avoid the way stations on I-5, where teenagers go to race their cars away from city cops, and where you can drive for an hour without seeing another soul. During the day, it's just another piece of asphalt cutting through endless pine forests. But at night, it becomes something else entirely. The darkness out there isn't like city darkness. It's absolute, broken only by your headlights cutting a narrow tunnel through the black. I actually preferred the night shift, which most cops thought made me crazy. But there was something peaceful about it, something honest. During the day, you dealt with people at their most mundane: traffic violations, fender benders, domestic disputes. But at night, you saw people at their most vulnerable: the drunk drivers who'd lost control of more than just their vehicles, the families broken down on the side of the road far from help, the teenagers who'd gotten in over their heads. At night, people needed you in a way they didn't during the day, and being there for them, being that lifeline in the darkness, gave the job meaning. My patrol sector covered 60 miles of Highway 49, from the junction at Grants Pass all the way to the California border. I knew every mile of it intimately, every curve where speeders liked to push their luck, every straightaway where deer crossed, every hidden turnout where teenagers parked. Mile marker 47 was just another green sign on an endless stretch of road, positioned at a particularly unremarkable section where the highway ran straight as an arrow through dense forest on both sides. There was nothing special about it, nothing that would make you look twice. In 5 years of patrolling that stretch, I'd probably passed it 1,000 times without giving it a second thought. The night of October 15th started like any other. I'd arrived at the station at 10:30 p.m. for the 11 p.m. roll call, grabbed a cup of coffee that had been sitting in the pot since the afternoon shift, and shot the shit with the other guys coming on duty. There was Martinez, who was working the southern section near the border, Phillips covering the city limits, and me heading out to the highway. Our sergeant, Davies, was in one of his good moods, cracking jokes about the full moon and warning us about the crazies it would bring out. "Torres, you're solo on 49 tonight," Davies announced, checking his clipboard. Johnson called in sick again. Johnson had been my usual partner for highway patrol, but he'd been calling in sick more and more lately. At the time, I just figured he was burned out or had some family issues he was dealing with. Looking back now, I wonder if he knew something, if he'd sensed something about that stretch of road that made him want to stay away. But that October night, I didn't give it much thought beyond mild annoyance at having to patrol alone. The drive out to Highway 49 took about 20 minutes from the station. I stopped at the 24-hour gas station at the junction, a little place called Mel's that served as the unofficial halfway point between civilization and the wilderness. Cheryl was working the night shift, like always, a middle-aged woman with a perpetual smile and a thermos of coffee that was somehow always better than what we had at the station. She'd been there as long as anyone could remember, knew every cop by name, and always asked about our families. "Quiet night so far, Mike?" she asked as I paid for my usual, a large black coffee and a pack of sunflower seeds to help stay alert. "So far," I replied, pocketing my change. "But the night's young." She laughed at that, the same easy laugh she'd had since I first started patrolling. "You be safe out there. Fog's supposed to roll in later, already getting thick down in the valleys." Fog was common in October, especially in the low-lying areas where cold air settled between the hills. It could make driving treacherous, but after 5 years on these roads, I'd gotten used to it. The key was to take it slow, use your fog lights instead of high beams, and always assume there was something just beyond your visibility that you needed to be ready for. I left Mel's at 11:47 p.m., according to the receipt I found later in my pocket. The temperature had dropped to about 40 degrees, and I could see my breath in the air as I walked to my cruiser. The car was a 1993 Ford Crown Victoria Police Interceptor, black and white with the Oregon State Police shield on the doors. She had 150,000 miles on her but ran smooth as silk because I took care of her. In a job where your vehicle could mean the difference between life and death, you learn to treat it with respect. The first hour of my patrol was completely routine. I cruised the highway at a steady 55 mph, occasionally pushing up to 70 on the long straightaways. The radar guns stayed quiet. The few vehicles I encountered were all doing the speed limit or close enough that I didn't bother pulling them over. There were 2 semis heading south, probably making overnight runs to California, a couple of passenger cars with out-of-state plates, and one local pickup truck I recognized as belonging to Jim Patterson, who worked the early shift at the lumber mill. Around 12:30 a.m., I pulled over a semi that was weaving slightly within its lane. The driver was a young guy, maybe mid-20s, with bloodshot eyes that immediately had me on alert. But when I got close, I could smell coffee instead of alcohol, and his logs showed he'd been driving for 10 hours straight. He was exhausted, not drunk, pushing himself to make a deadline in Sacramento. I could have written him up for driving while fatigued, but instead, I convinced him to pull off at the rest stop about 10 miles ahead and catch a few hours of sleep. He thanked me, said his dispatcher would give him hell, but it was better than ending up in a ditch. I watched him drive away, maintaining a steady line now that he knew I was watching, and hoped he'd actually stop. At 1:15 a.m., I came across a family broken down on the shoulder. Their minivan had a flat tire, and the father was struggling with the jack in the cold while his wife tried to keep their 2 young kids calm inside the vehicle. They had California plates, probably heading home from a vacation in Portland. The man's hands were shaking from the cold as he tried to work the tire iron, and I could see the relief wash over his face when my lights lit up behind them. "Let me help you with that," I offered, grabbing my flashlight. It's not technically part of the job, but out here, sometimes being a cop meant being whatever people needed you to be. Mechanic, medic, counselor, or just an extra pair of hands. We got the tire changed in about 15 minutes, the man thanking me repeatedly while his wife offered me homemade cookies from their travel supplies, which I politely declined. The kids pressed their faces against the back window, waving at me with the kind of enthusiasm only children can muster at 1 a.m. As they drove away, I found myself thinking about my own daughter, Emma, safe in bed at home. She was about the same age as those kids, and moments like this reminded me why I did this job, to make sure families like that made it home safely. By 2 a.m., the fog Cheryl had warned me about was starting to form. It crept in slowly at first, thin wisps that danced in my headlights, but gradually it thickened until visibility was down to maybe 50 feet in the worst spots. I slowed my patrol speed to 35 mph and turned on my fog lights, the yellow beams cutting through the mist better than my regular headlights would. The radio chatter had died down to almost nothing, just the occasional check-in from other units and Sandra's calm voice acknowledging from dispatch. I'd been patrolling Highway 49 for 5 years, and I'd seen it in every possible condition. Blazing summer heat that made the asphalt shimmer, winter ice storms that turned it into a skating rink, spring floods that washed out whole sections. But there was something about fog that changed the character of the road entirely. It isolated you, cut you off from the world beyond your windshield. The familiar landmarks disappeared, and even a road you knew by heart became alien and uncertain. The trees on either side became vague suggestions of shapes, and the highway itself seemed to narrow, as if the fog was physically pressing in on you. At 2:27 a.m., I passed mile marker 47 for the first time that night. It emerged from the fog like all the other markers, a brief flash of reflective green in my headlights before disappearing into the darkness behind me. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing that made it stand out from markers 46 or 48. The road was straight there, the forest thick on both sides, no turnouts or side roads. Just another arbitrary point on an arbitrary road in an arbitrary night that should have remained unremarkable. I reached the southern end of my patrol sector around 2:45 a.m. and turned around at the wide shoulder near mile marker 72. The fog was even thicker heading northbound, and I radioed in to dispatch to report the conditions. Sandra's voice crackled through the speaker, professional but warm. She'd been our night dispatcher for 5 years and had a way of making you feel less alone out there in the darkness. Unit 7749 to dispatch. Visibility is deteriorating out here on 49. Fog is getting pretty thick between markers 45 and 60. Might want to put out an advisory. Copy that, 7749. I'll notify Caltrans and get a warning out. How are you doing out there, Mike? I'm good, Sandy. Just taking it slow. 10-4. Be careful out there. There was something comforting about these check-ins, these brief moments of human contact in the isolation of the night shift. They reminded you that you weren't really alone, that somewhere back in town, someone was keeping track of you, would notice if you didn't report in. It was a lifeline, thin but vital, stretching back through the darkness to civilization. At 3:15 a.m., I pulled into the rest area near mile marker 52 to stretch my legs and use the facilities. The parking lot was nearly empty, just 2 semis parked at the far end with their running lights on, their drivers probably catching some mandated rest. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see the restroom building from the parking lot, and the overhead lights created these perfect spheres of illumination in the mist, like glowing bubbles floating in a sea of gray. The rest area was one of those basic state-maintained facilities, a concrete block building with separate men's and women's restrooms, a few picnic tables, and a map of Oregon behind scratched plexiglass. During the day, it would be full of families walking dogs, truckers checking their routes, tourists taking pictures of the forest. But at night, it became something else. A lonely outpost in the wilderness, a brief respite from the endless road. I stood there for a moment after using the restroom, just listening to the silence. Fog has a way of dampening sound, absorbing it, making the world feel muffled and distant. Even my footsteps on the concrete seemed quieter than they should be. The only sound was the distant idle of the semi-engines, a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. There was something almost peaceful about it, something that made you want to just stand there and exist in that moment of absolute stillness. But I had a job to do, miles to patrol, and the night wasn't getting any younger. I walked back to my cruiser, my breath forming clouds in the cold air that mixed with the fog until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The leather of my duty belt creaked as I settled back into the driver's seat, a familiar sound that had become part of the rhythm of the job. I took a sip of coffee that had gone cold, grimaced at the bitter taste, and pulled back onto the highway. It was 3:25 a.m. when I left the rest area, according to the log I kept. 8 minutes later, everything would change. 8 minutes between the normal world I'd known for 41 years and something else, something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. 8 minutes that would stretch into an eternity and collapse into a single moment of pure, undiluted terror. As I drove north on Highway 49, the fog seemed to thicken with each passing mile marker. 53, 52, 51, 50. Each one appearing and disappearing like ghostly sentinels in the mist. My speed had dropped to 25 mph now, the fog so dense that I could barely see 20 feet ahead. The forest on either side had completely disappeared, swallowed by the gray wall that surrounded me. It was like driving through a tunnel made of mist, with no beginning and no end, just an endless corridor of gray. I'd driven in fog like this before, plenty of times. It was part of the job, part of living in Oregon. You learn to trust your instruments more than your eyes, to follow the white line on the side of the road, to ignore the tricks your mind played on you when you'd been staring into the mist for too long. Sometimes you'd see shapes that weren't there, movement in your peripheral vision that turned out to be nothing. The key was to stay calm, stay focused, and remember that it was just weather, just water droplets suspended in air. Nothing more, nothing less. But that night, as I approached mile marker 47 for the second time, something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it exactly, couldn't articulate what had changed, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. It was like the feeling you get when you know someone's watching you, that primitive alertness that evolution hardwired into our brains to keep us alive. Every nerve in my body was suddenly on edge, every sense heightened. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, my eyes scanned the fog a little more intensively, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice that sounded a lot like instinct was telling me to turn around, to get away from here as fast as possible. But I was a cop, and cops don't run from bad feelings. We run toward them, investigate them, find rational explanations for them. So I kept driving, maintaining my steady 25 mph despite every fiber of my being telling me to floor it. And at exactly 3:33 a.m., according to the digital clock on my dashboard that would later become burned into my memory like a brand, I saw the car. At the highway patrol incident that made me quit. Part 2. The Abandoned Vehicle. The car appeared out of the fog like a ghost materializing from another dimension. One moment there was nothing but gray mist and empty road, and the next, there it was. A silver Honda Accord, late 1980s model from what I could tell, parked at an odd angle on the shoulder right at mile marker 47. The hazard lights were blinking rhythmically, casting amber pulses into the fog that seemed to be swallowed up after just a few feet. But it was the driver's door that made me slow down. It was wide open. the interior dome light creating a weak pool of yellow light that spilled out onto the gravel shoulder. My training kicked in immediately, overriding the unease that had been building in my chest. This was a standard roadside assistance situation, probably someone with engine trouble who'd walked to find cell phone reception, though cell phones were still pretty rare in 1995, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. I pulled up behind the vehicle, positioning my cruiser at a slight angle to protect the scene from any traffic that might come through, though I hadn't seen another vehicle in almost 30 minutes. The fog was so thick now that my emergency lights seemed to just illuminate the mist around my car, creating a bubble of red and blue that pulsed like a heartbeat. I grabbed my mag light and portable radio, clipping the latter to my belt as I'd done 1,000 times before. The procedure was automatic, drilled into me through years of training and experience. Approach from the passenger side if possible. Keep your flashlight in your weak hand, strong hand free to reach your weapon if necessary. Not that I expected trouble. In 5 years of patrolling this stretch, I'd never had to draw my weapon once. But procedure was procedure, and it had kept me safe this long. Unit 7749 to dispatch, I said into the radio, my breath visible in the cold air. I've got an abandoned vehicle at mile marker 47, southbound shoulder. Appears to be a late model Honda Accord, silver or gray. Driver's door open, no visible occupants, running the plates now. Sandra's voice came back immediately, professional and alert despite the late hour. Copy 7749. Do you need backup? I looked around at the wall of fog surrounding me, at the empty car with its door hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was wrong here, but I couldn't request backup because of a feeling. That's not how it worked. You needed something concrete, something more than just a bad vibe from an abandoned car. Negative, dispatch. Probably just a breakdown. Driver might have walked for help. I'll investigate and report back. 10-4, 7749. Be careful out there, Mike. The plates came back registered to Marcus Webb, 34 years old, Portland address. No warrants, no criminal record, nothing that would indicate this was anything other than a motorist in distress. I approached the vehicle slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog to illuminate the interior. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine off but the electrical system still on. That's why the hazards were still working. A cell phone, one of those Motorola flip phones that cost a fortune, was sitting on the passenger seat, and I could see a wallet in the center console. The interior of the car was immaculate, no signs of struggle or disturbance. There was a travel mug in the cup holder, still half full of what looked like coffee. When I carefully reached in to touch it, it was still warm. Not hot, but warm enough to tell me the car hadn't been here long. Maybe 30 minutes, an hour at most. The radio was on, but turned down low, barely audible static from a station that had gone off the air for the night. I did a quick inventory of the visible items. The wallet contained a driver's license confirming Marcus Webb's identity, about $60 in cash, and several credit cards. The cell phone showed a full charge but no signal, which wasn't surprising out here. There was a small suitcase in the back seat and what looked like a laptop bag, expensive-looking items that no thief would leave behind. Whatever had caused Marcus Webb to abandon his vehicle, it wasn't robbery. Standing up from my examination of the car's interior, I swept my flashlight around the immediate area. The shoulder here was gravel over packed earth, and even in the fog, I could see footprints leading away from the driver's side door. They headed straight toward the tree line, which was barely visible as a dark wall beyond the reach of my flashlight. The prints were clear and recent, undisturbed by wind or weather. Adult male from the size, walking with purpose, not stumbling or running, just walking directly into the forest. Now, this is where I should have called it in, waited for backup, followed procedure. A person entering the woods at night in heavy fog was a search and rescue situation, not something a single officer should handle. But there was something about those footprints, something about the deliberate way they led into the trees, that made me think Marcus Webb hadn't gone far. Maybe he'd just stepped into the woods to relieve himself, gotten turned around in the fog. It happened more often than you'd think. City people especially had no idea how quickly you could get lost once you left the road. I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I decided to follow the tracks, just for a little ways, just to see if I could spot him or call out to him. I told myself I'd go 50 feet, maybe 100, no more, just far enough to do my due diligence before calling in search and rescue. "Mr. Webb?" I called out toward the tree line, my voice seeming to be absorbed by the fog before it could travel more than a few feet. "Marcus Webb? This is Officer Torres with the State Police. If you can hear me, please respond. Are you injured?" The silence that answered me was complete, total, the kind of silence that only exists in places far from civilization. No wind, no animal sounds, not even the distant hum of traffic. It was as if the fog had created a bubble around this spot, cutting it off from the rest of the world. The only sound was my own breathing and the faint tick, tick, tick of the Honda's cooling engine behind me. I stepped off the shoulder and into the forest, following the footprints. The ground immediately changed from gravel to soft forest floor, a carpet of pine needles and decomposing leaves that muffled my footsteps. The trees seemed to close in around me immediately, their trunks appearing out of the fog like massive pillars in some ancient temple. My flashlight beam could only penetrate about 10 feet into the mist, creating a small bubble of visibility that moved with me as I walked. The footprints were easy to follow at first, clear impressions in the soft ground that led straight into the forest. No meandering, no hesitation, just a straight line, as if Marcus Webb had known exactly where he was going. That should have been my first real warning sign. Nobody walks that confidently into unfamiliar woods at night, especially in fog this thick. But I was focused on finding him, on doing my job, on being the cop who didn't give up just because conditions were difficult. About 50 feet in, I stopped and called out again. "Mr. Webb, State Police. If you're injured or lost, please make some noise so I can find you." Nothing. Just that oppressive silence and the fog swirling around me in patterns that didn't quite seem natural. It was moving, rotating slowly, almost like it was alive. I shook my head at the thought. Fog was just water vapor, nothing more. The stress of the night shift could make you see patterns where none existed. I should have turned back then. 50 feet was what I'd told myself, and I'd gone 50 feet. But the footprints continued, clear and purposeful, and I could feel that cop instinct kicking in. The same instinct that made you pursue a suspect just a little further, push an interrogation just a little harder, dig just a little deeper into a case. Something had happened here, something more than just a broken-down car, and I needed to know what. Another 50 feet into the forest, and the footprints were still clear, still heading in that impossibly straight line. The trees were denser here, older, their trunks thick enough that it would take 3 people holding hands to circle them. The fog seemed even thicker among the trees, if that was possible, and my flashlight beam was reflecting off it in strange ways, creating shadows that moved and shifted in my peripheral vision. That's when I noticed something that made me stop cold. The footprints I was following, they ended. Not gradually, not like someone had started walking on harder ground or changed direction. They just stopped, mid-stride, as if Marcus Webb had simply ceased to exist between one step and the next. The last print was clear, perfect, the toe dug in as if pushing off for the next step. But there was no next step. No disturbance in the pine needles beyond. No sign that anyone had ever walked further than this exact spot. I crouched down, examining the last footprint more carefully. It was definitely recent, the edges still sharp and well-defined. I looked up, shining my flashlight into the canopy above, absurdly thinking maybe he'd climbed a tree. But the branches were too high, and there were no marks on the trunk to indicate anyone had climbed anything. I stood slowly, turning in a complete circle, my flashlight beam penetrating the fog in every direction. Nothing. No sign of Marcus Webb or any indication of where he might have gone. That's when I heard it. A whisper, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. It seemed to come from deeper in the woods, from multiple directions at once, or maybe from no direction at all. It was my name. "Officer Torres." I spun around, my hand instinctively dropping to my service weapon. "Who's there? Mr. Webb? Identify yourself." The whisper came again, clearer this time, and definitely not just one voice. It was like multiple people speaking in perfect unison, their voices blending together into something that was almost but not quite human. "Officer Michael Torres, badge number 7749. My blood turned to ice. That was my badge number. But how could anyone out here know that? I drew my weapon, keeping it at low ready, my flashlight beam dancing through the trees as I tried to locate the source of the voices. "Mr. Webb, if that's you, you need to come out now. Show yourself." "Michael Joseph Torres, born March 15th, 1954, currently residing at 1247 Riverside Drive. Wife Patricia Ann Torres, maiden name Patterson. Daughter Emma Marie Torres, age 7, student at Riverside Elementary." The voices, continued their recitation, and with each piece of information, my fear ratcheted up another notch. This wasn't public information. My address was unlisted for safety reasons. Emma's school, Patricia's maiden name. These were details that nobody outside my immediate family should know. My hand holding the flashlight was trembling now, making the beam shake and causing the shadows between the trees to dance and writhe. "Whoever you are, you need to stop this right now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and failing. "This is a police officer you're threatening. Back off now, or I will use force." The response was soft laughter, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not malicious laughter, but something worse. The kind of laugh you might make at a child who doesn't understand something obvious. "You wrote your first ticket on June 5th, 1968 at 2:17 p.m. Red 1965 Chevrolet Impala, license plate RKM 782. Driver was Robert James Carlson, age 23. You were so nervous your hands shook when you wrote it. You spelled vehicle wrong and had to start over." I remembered that ticket. It was my first day on the job, fresh out of the academy, eager to prove myself. I'd been so embarrassed about misspelling vehicle that I'd never told anyone about it, not even Patricia. The citation I'd had to void was destroyed, thrown away. There was no record of that mistake anywhere except in my own memory. "Your brother Tommy drowned when you were 7 years old. August 13th, 1961. Lake Oswego. You were supposed to be watching him while your mother was in the bathroom. You got distracted by a comic book. Superman issue 147. When you looked up, he was floating face down. You've never forgiven yourself." I couldn't breathe. Nobody knew about the comic book. I'd never told anyone, not even the therapist my parents had made me see after Tommy's death. It was a detail I'd buried so deep that sometimes I could almost convince myself I'd forgotten it. But I hadn't. I remembered the cover perfectly. Superman dead, Lex Luthor standing over his body. I'd been so engrossed in the story that I'd forgotten my 5-year-old brother couldn't swim. The fog around me began to move in a way that defied physics. It wasn't drifting or flowing like fog should. It was rotating, slowly, deliberately, like I was standing in the eye of the world's laziest tornado. And in that rotating wall of mist, I began to see shapes, figures, people. They were all walking in the same direction, deeper into the forest, and they were all wrong somehow. Some were translucent, visible only in the fog itself, disappearing when I shined my light directly at them. Others seemed more solid, but were dressed in clothes from different eras. A woman in a 1950s dress, a man in what looked like a uniform from World War I, children in clothing styles I couldn't even place. They all had the same expression, blank, empty, like sleepwalkers or mannequins, and they were all walking with the same measured, purposeful stride, all heading in the same direction, all completely silent. "Join us, Michael." The voice was coming from all of them now, dozens of mouths moving in perfect synchronization, creating a chorus that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly into my mind. "We've been waiting for you." Everyone stops at mile marker 47 eventually. Everyone joins the walk. Among the walking figures, I saw him. Marcus Webb. He was about 10 feet away, walking parallel to me, that same blank expression on his face, that same mechanical stride. He was wearing the same clothes described in his DMV records, jeans and a Portland Trail Blazers jacket. But when I shined my flashlight directly at him, he vanished, only to reappear in my peripheral vision, still walking, still blank-faced, still silent. "Mr. Webb!" I shouted, moving toward him. But he didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear me. He just kept walking, and as I moved to intercept him, he seemed to always be just out of reach, always the same distance away, no matter how fast I moved. "He can't hear you," the chorus of voices said. "He's walking the true path now. The path that runs parallel to your world, between the seconds, between the heartbeats. The path that has always been here, collecting travelers since before your roads were built, since before your ancestors arrived, since the world was young and the boundaries were thin." The walking figures were getting closer now, not changing direction, but somehow closing in on me with each circuit they made through the fog. I could see more details, the vacancy in their eyes, the mechanical precision of their movements, the way they seemed to exist in multiple moments at once, flickering between different positions like a film running at the wrong speed. "Your partner Johnson knows," the voices continued. "That's why he doesn't patrol this stretch anymore. He saw us 3 months ago, but he was smart. He stayed in his car. He didn't follow. He didn't investigate. He went home and requested a transfer to day shift. But you had to be the hero, didn't you, Michael? Had to help, had to investigate. That's what makes you such a good cop, and that's what brought you to us." Johnson. All those sick days suddenly made sense. He'd seen something out here, something that had scared him enough to avoid Highway 49 entirely. And he'd never said anything, never warned me. Or maybe he had tried in his own way. I remembered him asking me once if I ever felt strange out on the highway at night, if I ever saw things in the fog. I'd laughed it off, told him he needed to lay off the coffee. He'd never brought it up again. The figures were close enough now that I could have reached out and touched them if they'd been solid. I could see details I wished I couldn't, the way their skin seemed to be slightly out of phase with reality, blurring at the edges like a photograph of someone moving. The way their clothes seemed to be from the moment they'd started walking, pristine and untouched by time, even though some of them had clearly been walking for decades. I saw a young girl who couldn't have been more than 8, wearing a dress that looked like it was from the 1930s. Her hair was in perfect ringlets, her patent leather shoes shiny and new. But her eyes were empty, ancient, like she'd been walking for so long that whatever had made her human had worn away, leaving only the motion, the endless forward progress. "This is the real Highway 49, Michael," the voices said, and now I could feel breath on the back of my neck, cold and damp like fog made solid. "The one that exists in the spaces between your reality, the one that collects those who stop, who investigate, who step off the path they're supposed to follow. You're not the first cop to find us. Officer Mills in 1978, Deputy Kowalski in 1985. They're walking with us now. They've been walking for so long they don't even remember why they started. I turned and ran. I ran with the kind of desperate, primal terror that bypasses conscious thought entirely. My body moved on pure instinct, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my uniform, my flashlight beam swinging wildly and creating a chaotic strobe effect in the fog. Behind me, those voices continued their chorus, not shouting or growing angry, just maintaining that same calm, measured tone that was somehow more terrifying than any scream could have been. "You can't leave, Michael. No one leaves mile marker 47. You're between worlds now, between moments. The road has claimed you, and the road never lets go." The forest seemed to actively work against me as I ran. Trees appeared in my path that hadn't been there moments before, forcing me to dodge and weave. The ground beneath my feet shifted from soft pine needles to treacherous roots that caught my boots and tried to send me sprawling. More than once, I had to catch myself against a trunk, the rough bark scraping my palms through my gloves. My breathing was ragged, my lungs burning from the cold air and exertion, but I didn't dare stop. I could feel them behind me, not pursuing exactly, but following, patient and inevitable like death itself. The fog was playing tricks with distance and direction. I'd been certain I was running back toward the highway, back toward my cruiser and safety, but the forest seemed endless. Every direction looked the same. Dark trees emerging from gray mist. No landmarks, no reference points. My radio crackled with static when I tried to call for help, the signal blocked by something that wasn't quite interference but wasn't quite silence either. It was like the space I was in existed on a different frequency from the rest of the world. Then suddenly, I burst through a particularly thick wall of undergrowth and found myself on pavement. But it was wrong, all wrong. The road was too narrow. The asphalt old and cracked in a way that Highway 49 hadn't been since the last resurfacing in 1992. There were no lane markings, no reflectors, no mile markers. It was like I'd stumbled onto a version of the highway from decades ago, or maybe a version that existed outside of normal time altogether. A car came around the curve ahead of me, and I frantically waved my arms, trying to flag it down. But as it got closer, my relief turned to horror. It was a Model T Ford, pristine as if it had just rolled off the assembly line, and the driver had that same blank expression, that same mechanical movement as the walking figures in the forest. The car passed right through the space where I stood, not around me, but through me, as if I was the one who wasn't quite real. I felt it as it passed, a cold unlike anything I'd ever experienced, not the absence of heat but the presence of something else. Something that made my bones ache and my teeth hurt. More vehicles came, a parade of automotive history all traveling this wrong version of the highway. A 1950s Cadillac with tail fins like shark teeth, its chrome gleaming despite the fog. A 1970s station wagon with wood paneling, a family visible through the windows. 2 parents in the front, 3 kids in the back, all with those same empty expressions, all staring straight ahead. A horse-drawn carriage that belonged in a museum. Its occupants dressed in clothing from the 1800s. They all passed through me, each passage bringing that terrible cold, each one making me feel a little less solid, a little less real. "This is the true Highway 49, Michael," the voices said, and now they seemed to come from the road itself, from the asphalt beneath my feet. The one that exists in the spaces between seconds, the one that runs parallel to yours but touches it at certain points. Mile marker 47 is one of those points, a place where the boundary is thin, where people can step from one road to the other. Most never realize they've done it. They just walk into the forest and never walk out, becoming part of the eternal traffic, the endless journey. I ran across the not highway, desperate to get away from those vehicles that shouldn't exist, and plunged back into the forest on the other side. The trees here were different, older, more primitive somehow, like something out of a prehistoric forest. The fog was thicker, almost solid, and my flashlight barely penetrated it at all. But I could hear something that gave me hope. Sirens. Real sirens. Current sirens. Not the old-fashioned bells and whistles of the phantom vehicles. My backup had arrived. Sandra must have sent them when I failed to check in. The relief I felt was physical, like a weight lifting off my chest. I ran toward the sound, crashing through the underbrush with renewed energy. But the forest seemed to stretch and contract around me, the sirens getting closer and then further away without any logic to it. I could hear voices too, real human voices calling my name, but they sounded like they were coming through water, distorted and impossible to locate. "They won't find you, Michael," the chorus said, and now there was something almost like pity in their tone. "You're not in their world anymore. You're between, in the spaces that exist in every forest, on every road, in every moment of transition. You can hear them, but they can't hear you. You can see their lights, but they can't see yours. You're walking the border between what is and what isn't, and once you've started that walk, it's very hard to stop." But I refused to accept that. I was Michael Torres, Officer Michael Torres, and I had a wife and daughter waiting for me at home. I had a life, a real life, not this nightmare existence between worlds. I thought about Patricia, about the way she smiled when I came home safe after a shift, about Emma running to greet me at the door, shouting, "Daddy!" with pure joy. Those were real things, solid things, anchors to the world I belonged in. I stopped running for a moment, closed my eyes, and tried to center myself. My training had included a brief section on panic and disorientation, how to ground yourself when you'd lost your bearings. Find something real, something you know is true, and hold on to it. I thought about my cruiser, about exactly where I'd parked it at mile marker 47. I thought about the sequence of events that had brought me into the forest, the abandoned Honda, the footprints, the straight line into the trees. Those things had happened in the real world, which meant the real world was still out there, still accessible. When I opened my eyes, the fog seemed slightly less oppressive, the forest a bit more familiar. I could still hear the sirens, but now they seemed to be coming from a consistent direction. I started moving toward them, not running in panic, but walking purposefully, deliberately, refusing to give in to the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. The walking figures appeared again, surrounding me, matching my pace. Marcus Webb was among them, along with dozens of others. I recognized some of them now, faces from missing person reports I'd seen over the years, people who'd vanished along Highway 49 and never been found. They walked in perfect synchronization, their footsteps making no sound, their presence more like a memory of people than actual people. "You're fighting so hard," the voices said, and now they sounded almost sad. "Don't you understand? This isn't a punishment. It's a release. No more decisions, no more responsibilities, no more guilt about Tommy, no more wondering if you're a good enough husband, father, cop. Just the walk, eternal, peaceful, purposeful, going everywhere and nowhere, forever." The mention of Tommy almost broke me. The guilt I'd carried for 34 years, the weight of it, the way it colored everything in my life. How many times had I wondered what kind of man he would have become? How many times had I apologized to his ghost? The idea of letting go of that guilt, of just walking and not thinking, not feeling, it was tempting in a way that terrified me. But then I thought about Emma, and how I'd sworn I would always be there for her, would always keep her safe. I couldn't do that if I gave in, if I joined these hollow echoes of people walking their endless path. She needed her father, not some empty shell wandering between worlds. "This is the true Highway 49, Michael," the voices said, and now they seemed to come from the road itself, from the asphalt beneath my feet. The one that exists in the spaces between seconds, the one that runs parallel to yours but touches it at certain points. Mile marker 47 is one of those points, a place where the boundary is thin, where people can step from one road to the other. Most never realize they've done it. They just walk into the forest and never walk out, becoming part of the eternal traffic, the endless journey. I ran across the not highway, desperate to get away from those vehicles that shouldn't exist, and plunged back into the forest on the other side. The trees here were different, older, more primitive somehow, like something out of a prehistoric forest. The fog was thicker, almost solid, and my flashlight barely penetrated it at all. But I could hear something that gave me hope. Sirens. Real sirens. Current sirens. Not the old-fashioned bells and whistles of the phantom vehicles. My backup had arrived. Sandra must have sent them when I failed to check in. The relief I felt was physical, like a weight lifting off my chest. I ran toward the sound, crashing through the underbrush with renewed energy. But the forest seemed to stretch and contract around me, the sirens getting closer and then further away without any logic to it. I could hear voices too, real human voices calling my name, but they sounded like they were coming through water, distorted and impossible to locate. "They won't find you, Michael," the chorus said, and now there was something almost like pity in their tone. "You're not in their world anymore. You're between, in the spaces that exist in every forest, on every road, in every moment of transition. You can hear them, but they can't hear you. You can see their lights, but they can't see yours. You're walking the border between what is and what isn't, and once you've started that walk, it's very hard to stop." But I refused to accept that. I was Michael Torres, Officer Michael Torres, and I had a wife and daughter waiting for me at home. I had a life, a real life, not this nightmare existence between worlds. I thought about Patricia, about the way she smiled when I came home safe after a shift, about Emma running to greet me at the door, shouting, "Daddy!" with pure joy. Those were real things, solid things, anchors to the world I belonged in. I stopped running for a moment, closed my eyes, and tried to center myself. My training had included a brief section on panic and disorientation, how to ground yourself when you'd lost your bearings. Find something real, something you know is true, and hold on to it. I thought about my cruiser, about exactly where I'd parked it at mile marker 47. I thought about the sequence of events that had brought me into the forest, the abandoned Honda, the footprints, the straight line into the trees. Those things had happened in the real world, which meant the real world was still out there, still accessible. When I opened my eyes, the fog seemed slightly less oppressive, the forest a bit more familiar. I could still hear the sirens, but now they seemed to be coming from a consistent direction. I started moving toward them, not running in panic, but walking purposefully, deliberately, refusing to give in to the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. The walking figures appeared again, surrounding me, matching my pace. Marcus Webb was among them, along with dozens of others. I recognized some of them now, faces from missing person reports I'd seen over the years, people who'd vanished along Highway 49 and never been found. They walked in perfect synchronization, their footsteps making no sound, their presence more like a memory of people than actual people. "You're fighting so hard," the voices said, and now they sounded almost sad. "Don't you understand? This isn't a punishment. It's a release. No more decisions, no more responsibilities, no more guilt about Tommy, no more wondering if you're a good enough husband, father, cop. Just the walk, eternal, peaceful, purposeful, going everywhere and nowhere, forever." The mention of Tommy almost broke me. The guilt I'd carried for 34 years, the weight of it, the way it colored everything in my life. How many times had I wondered what kind of man he would have become? How many times had I apologized to his ghost? The idea of letting go of that guilt, of just walking and not thinking, not feeling, it was tempting in a way that terrified me. But then I thought about Emma, and how I'd sworn I would always be there for her, would always keep her safe. I couldn't do that if I gave in, if I joined these hollow echoes of people walking their endless path. She needed her father, not some empty shell wandering between worlds. They wanted to keep me for observation, but I insisted on going home. I needed to see Patricia and Emma, needed to ground myself in their reality before the memory of that other place faded or drove me insane. The drive home was surreal. Every mile marker we passed seemed to pulse with significance. Every patch of fog made my hands tighten on the door handle. Deputy Harrison drove me, keeping up a steady stream of normal conversation, football scores, department gossip, anything to fill the silence. But I could see him glancing at me in the rearview mirror, could see the questions he wasn't asking. Patricia was waiting on the porch when we pulled up, still in her nightgown with a coat thrown over it. She'd gotten the call that I was missing and had been up ever since, pacing the house, making coffee she didn't drink, trying not to wake Emma with her worry. When she saw me get out of the car, she ran to me, threw her arms around me, and held on like she was afraid I might disappear again. "Don't ever do that to me again," she whispered into my shoulder, and I could feel her tears soaking through my uniform. "When they said you were missing, that you just vanished, I thought, I'm okay," I told her, holding her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair, the realness of her. "I'm home. I'm not going anywhere." But even as I said it, I could feel it. The pull, subtle, like a thread connected to my spine, tugging gently but persistently toward the west, toward Highway 49, toward mile marker 47. The voices had been right about that much. Once the road notices you, really notices you, it never lets go completely. The next few days passed in a strange haze, like I was moving through the world wrapped in cotton. Everything felt slightly unreal, slightly disconnected, as if I wasn't quite synchronized with the rest of reality. Patricia watched me constantly, her eyes following me around the house with a mixture of concern and fear. She knew something had happened out there on Highway 49, something more than just getting lost in the fog, but she didn't push me to talk about it. Not yet. She just made sure I ate, made sure I slept, made sure I took the week of administrative leave Captain Reynolds had insisted on. Emma was the only thing that felt completely real during those days. 7 years old and blissfully unaware of how close she'd come to losing her father, she chattered about school, about her friends, about the drawing she'd made of our family that her teacher had put on the special bulletin board. I found myself staring at her sometimes, memorizing the way her nose crinkled when she laughed, the way she chewed on her pencil when she was thinking, the way she still needed her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hoppy, to fall asleep. These were real things, I told myself. These were the things that mattered. But at night, when the house was quiet and Patricia was asleep beside me, I could hear them. The voices from the forest, calling my name, reciting facts about my life, inviting me to join the eternal walk. Sometimes I'd get up and stand at the window, looking west toward Highway 49, and I'd swear I could see fog rolling in even on clear nights, fog that seemed to beckon and promise and threaten all at once. 3 days after the incident, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to know more, had to understand what had happened to me. I told Patricia I was going to the library to do some research for a case, which wasn't entirely a lie. She gave me a long look but didn't argue, just kissed me goodbye and told me to be careful. I think she knew I needed to process whatever had happened in my own way, in my own time. The Grants Pass Public Library was a small building that smelled of old paper and lemon furniture polish. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian who'd been there since before I was born, greeted me with her usual warm smile that faltered slightly when she saw my face. I must have looked as haunted as I felt. "Officer Torres," she said, and I could hear the question in her voice. "What can I help you with today?" "I need to see your historical archives," I told her. "Specifically, anything about Highway 49, going back as far as you have records." She led me to a back room filled with filing cabinets and boxes of documents, newspapers on microfilm, and thick-bound volumes of local history. "Anything in particular you're looking for?" she asked. And there was something in her tone that made me look at her more closely. Her eyes were knowing, sympathetic in a way that suggested she'd had this conversation before. "Disappearances," I said quietly. "Unexplained events. Anything unusual." She nodded slowly, then pulled out a specific box without having to check any index or catalog. "Start with this," she said. "And Officer Torres, whatever you found out there, whatever you saw, you're not the first. And you're not crazy." She left me alone with the box, and I spent the next 6 hours going through its contents. What I found chilled me to my core and confirmed my worst fears. Highway 49 had a history, a dark and twisted history that had been systematically covered up, explained away, or simply ignored for over a century. The earliest record I found was from 1887, before Highway 49 was even a highway. It was just a wagon trail then, cutting through the wilderness between what would eventually become Grants Pass and the California border. A wagon train of 43 people had set out to travel the trail in late October. They never arrived at their destination. Search parties found their wagons near what would later be designated as mile marker 47, but the people were gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no indication of where they'd gone. The wagons were in perfect condition, supplies untouched, even valuable items left behind. The only strange detail was that all the horses were found standing in a perfect line at the edge of the forest, staring into the trees with what witnesses described as empty, unseeing eyes. In 1923, after the trail had been paved and designated as Highway 49, a family of 5, the Wheelers, disappeared while driving from Portland to San Francisco. Their car was found at mile marker 47, engine still running, doors open, a meal spread on a blanket beside the road as if they'd just stepped away for a moment. The food was still warm. The search parties combed the area for weeks but found nothing. Not a single trace of the Wheeler family. The case was eventually closed, officially listed as presumed lost in wilderness, though no bodies were ever recovered. The pattern continued through the decades. 1946. A bus carrying 15 passengers vanished entirely. The vehicle found empty at mile marker 47 with the engine still idling. 1961. 3 separate cars, 3 separate nights, all found abandoned at the same spot. 1972. A convoy of military vehicles on a training exercise reported losing 2 trucks and 8 soldiers in thick fog near mile marker 47. The military classified the incident, but the local newspaper had run a small item about training accidents before being told to drop the story. And then I found something that made my hands shake so badly I had to set the paper down and take several deep breaths. A police report from 1978, filed by Officer Gerald Mills. His account was nearly identical to mine. The abandoned car, the footprints leading into the forest, the voices that knew impossible things, the walking figures, the escape. But there was an addendum to his report, added 2 weeks later. Officer Mills has submitted his resignation, effective immediately. Cited personal reasons. Forwarding address, Vermont. Vermont. As far from Highway 49 as you could get and still be in the country. Officer Mills had run, and he'd run far. I wondered if he still heard the voices, if he still felt the pull. There was another report from 1985, this one from Deputy Karl Kowalski. Again, the same pattern, the same experience, but his report ended differently. Deputy Kowalski failed to report for duty November 15, 1985. Personal vehicle found at mile marker 47. Deputy's whereabouts unknown. Case remains open. He'd gone back. Whatever had happened to him during his first encounter, he'd eventually returned to mile marker 47 and hadn't come back. I thought about the walking figures I'd seen in the fog, wondered if one of them had been wearing a deputy's uniform from the 1980s, wondered if Karl Kowalski was still walking that eternal path between worlds. The most recent report was from earlier this year, from my partner Johnson. His account was shorter, more clinical, but the fear came through in his carefully chosen words. He'd seen them, the walking figures, but he'd never left his vehicle. He'd sat in his cruiser for 3 hours, watching them pass by his windows, listening to them call his name, fighting the urge to open the door and follow. When dawn came and the fog lifted, they were gone, and he'd driven back to the station and requested an immediate transfer to day shift. The report was signed by Captain Reynolds with a note. Request approved. No further investigation required. They knew. Reynolds knew. The department knew. Maybe the whole damn state government knew. Highway 49 had been claiming people for over a century, and instead of closing the road or warning people, they'd chosen to cover it up, to let it continue, to sacrifice the occasional traveler to whatever existed at mile marker 47. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling from what I'd learned. Patricia was in the kitchen when I arrived, making dinner while Emma played with her dolls at the table. The domestic scene was so normal, so perfectly ordinary, that for a moment I could almost believe the last week had been a nightmare. But then Patricia turned to look at me, and I saw the fear still lingering in her eyes, the question she was afraid to ask. That night, after Emma was asleep, I told Patricia everything. The abandoned car that hadn't existed, the footprints that led nowhere, the voices that knew impossible things, the walking figures trapped between worlds. I showed her the copies I'd made of the historical records, the pattern of disappearances spanning over a century. She listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each detail, her hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said the words that would save my life. We're leaving. Tonight. Pack what we can carry. Get Emma. And go. Somewhere far from here. Somewhere without highways. Somewhere you can't be tempted to go back. My job. I started to protest, but she cut me off. Your job doesn't matter if you're not here. Those voices you hear, that pull you feel, it's only going to get stronger, isn't it? How long before you're like that deputy, unable to resist anymore? How long before Emma and I wake up to find you've gone back to mile marker 47 and not returned? She was right. I could feel it even now. That gentle but insistent tugging, like a fishhook caught in my soul. Every night it got a little stronger. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that fog, those walking figures, that other highway that existed between moments. It was calling me back, and eventually I would answer. We left that night, packed what we could fit in the car, woke Emma and told her we were going on an adventure, and drove east. I called Captain Reynolds from a payphone in Idaho, told him I was done, that I wouldn't be coming back. He didn't argue, didn't ask why. He just said, I understand, Mike. I'll handle the paperwork. Be safe. We settled in a small town in Vermont, in the mountains where the only road in or out was a 2-lane state route that had never been anything more than what it appeared to be. I got a job as a security guard at the local college. Patricia found work at the library. Emma adjusted to her new school, made new friends, and gradually stopped asking why we'd moved so suddenly. But the pull never went away. 28 years later, I still feel it. Every night at 3:33 a.m., I wake up and look west, toward Oregon, toward Highway 49, toward mile marker 47. The voices are quieter now, distant whispers rather than clear calls, but they're still there. Still inviting me to join the eternal walk, still promising release from the guilt over Tommy, from the weight of existence, from the burden of being human. I've kept track of the news from Oregon over the years. The disappearances continue. Every few months, another car found abandoned at mile marker 47. Another person vanished without a trace. They've put up warning signs about fog now, installed emergency phones, increased patrols. But it doesn't matter. The road takes who it wants to take. The boundary is thin there, and some people are just destined to cross it. Johnson called me once about 5 years after I left. He was still on day shift, still avoiding Highway 49. He told me they'd found another abandoned police cruiser at mile marker 47, a rookie named Martinez who'd been investigating a disabled vehicle report. They'd found the cruiser with the door open, lights still flashing, but Martinez was gone, just like I'd been gone for those 2 hours, except Martinez never came back. "Do you still hear them?" Johnson asked me, and I could hear the fear in his voice, the same fear I lived with every day. "Every night," I told him honestly. "But it gets easier. Distance helps. Time helps. But it never goes away completely." There was a long pause. Then Johnson said, "I'm thinking about transferring, maybe heading east, like you did." "Do it," I told him. "Do it before it's too late. Before you convince yourself that one more look won't hurt, that you're strong enough to resist. Because you're not. None of us are." I don't know if he took my advice. I never heard from him again. I'm writing this now because I'm getting old, and I need someone to know the truth before I'm gone. I've never told Emma about what really happened that night. She thinks we moved for a better job opportunity. But sometimes I catch her looking at me strangely when I wake up at 3:33 a.m., when I stand at the window staring west. Maybe she knows more than she lets on. Maybe the pull is hereditary. Maybe one day she'll feel it too, that call to visit a certain mile marker on a certain highway in Oregon. If you're reading this, if you're a cop or a trucker, or just someone who drives the lonely roads at night, remember this. There are places where the boundary between our world and others is thin. Places where you can step out of reality as easily as stepping off a curb. Mile marker 47 on Highway 49 is one of those places, but it's not the only one. They exist on roads all over the world, waiting patiently for someone to stop, to investigate, to step off the path they're supposed to follow. If you ever find yourself at such a place, if you see an abandoned car that shouldn't be there, footprints that lead nowhere, fog that moves wrong, don't stop, don't investigate, don't be a hero. Just drive. Drive fast and don't look back. Because once these places notice you, once they really see you, they never let go. You'll carry that connection for the rest of your life, hearing the whispers, feeling the pull, knowing that somewhere out there, a group of hollow people are walking an eternal path, and they're keeping a space open just for you. My name is Michael Torres. I was a good cop once, before I learned that some things are better left uninvestigated. Before I learned that there are worse fates than death, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is run. It's 3:33 a.m. as I finish writing this. I can hear them calling again, clearer tonight than they've been in years. Maybe it's because I've been thinking about them, remembering that night in detail. Or maybe it's because I'm dying. Cancer, the doctors say. Maybe 6 months left. And the boundary between worlds gets thinner when you're close to crossing over anyway. I won't go back. I promise Patricia that, even though she's been gone for 5 years now, I promise Emma, even though she's got her own family to worry about. I promise myself what's left of me. I'll die here in Vermont, far from Highway 49, far from mile marker 47. But sometimes late at night, when the pull is strongest and the voices are clearest, I wonder what would happen if I did go back. Would I find Marcus Webb still walking his endless path? Would I see Officer Mills and Deputy Kowalski among the eternal procession? Would the road remember me, welcome me back like a prodigal son returning home? I wonder, but I'll never know, because I'm never going back. At least, that's what I tell myself. Every night, at 3:33 a.m., when the voices are loudest. Final note found in Michael Torres's papers after his death in 2023. If you found this account among my things, it means I've passed on. Check the news from Oregon. Check if there have been any unusual reports from Highway 49 around the time of my death. Because even though I fought it for 28 years, even though I never physically returned to that cursed stretch of road, I'm not entirely sure where we go when we die. And I'm not entirely sure that death is enough to escape the pull of mile marker 47. If someone reports seeing an elderly man in an outdated police uniform walking along Highway 49, walking with purpose into the forest, walking with that mechanical stride of those who've joined the eternal procession, don't look for me. Don't try to help. Just drive. Drive fast. And whatever you do, whatever you hear, whatever you see, don't stop at mile marker 47.